very, very warm welcome to this early evening event. One of two, incidentally, some of you may already know this, but we have another one later this evening, which is also of a very informal, familial nature, if I can put it that way. Two granddaughters, in other words, talking about their illustrious grandfathers and fascinating grandfathers. But let's concentrate on the matter in hand. And let me start by introducing David Herman, who's misleadingly on our screen as Susie, his lovely wife. But it's David who will be chairing the event with Charlotte Grant, the granddaughter, of course, of Martin Bloch. And there's a very good reason for this. That is that some of you may already be aware of this, that his father, the wonderful artist Josef Herman, was a close friend of Martin Bloch. So it seemed entirely appropriate that David should preside over this evening's proceedings. Let me just say a few brief words of him about him by way of introduction. He was a TV producer for 20 years or so, and more recently has written about art, literature, and Jewish issues for a whole range of prestigious publications. I've already mentioned his connection to Joseph, a very close friend of Martin Bloch, as we will discover more later. And I'd just like to add, before I hand over to David to introduce Charlotte, that there was a wonderful exhibition of Joseph's work that was held as part of the real thing, Insiders Outsiders Festival, just in time actually in late 2019, early 2020, as at Flowers East in Kingsland Road. And also, and many thanks for this, David, he's been a very staunch supporter and ally from the very beginning, from the inception of the Insiders Outsiders Festival. So my gratitude goes out to you for that. Lovely. So let me hand over to David to set the ball rolling properly. Oh, actually, hold on. I've just realized I haven't said what you all know completely, and that is please keep muted if you wouldn't mind. And if you wouldn't mind also turning off your cameras, perhaps just at least for the moment. If there's any problem when Charlotte starts screen sharing in not being able to see the captions on the screen, what I would suggest you should do, and you probably all know this anyway, but if you go up to the sort of top right-hand side of your screen, there is actually an option to, and I quote, to show small active speaker video, and if you click on that, it eliminates everybody else who's still visible and shows Charlotte alone, which will minimize the risk of the captions being obscured. Lovely. And as regards asking questions, comments afterwards, again, you all know the ropes, I have absolutely no doubt. Please type questions you may have at any point you're ready to do so into the chat, and we'll see how things go, but we'll certainly have plenty of time for a Q&A afterwards. Okay, enough. Thank you. Over to you, David.
Thank you so much, Monica, and it's so lovely to see so many familiar faces out there. Martin Bloch, as I'm sure many of you will know, was born in 1883 and was one of the great German Jewish refugee artists. He came to Britain in 1934 and lived here for 20 years until his death in 1954. The Ben-Uri Gallery held a joint exhibition of his work and my father's work in 1949, and both exhibited at the Festival of Britain in 1951. And they were close friends, and my father always spoke fondly of Martin and his family. So it gives me enormous pleasure to chair this event in Martin's memory and to invite his granddaughter, Dr. Charlotte Grant, to speak about her grandfather. Charlotte is a leading literary critic who studied and taught at Cambridge, where she wrote her PhD on 18th century literature and visual culture. Following a master's in art history at the Courtauld Institute, she joined the new College of the Humanities in Bloomsbury as a founding member in 2011. Charlotte will be talking about Martin for about 40 minutes or so. I will then ask a few questions just to get things going, and then throw things open to you in the audience for further questions. So without any further ado, Charlotte.
Great, thank you, David. So hello, everybody. Yeah, familiar faces. I can see some members of my family there and colleagues, which is lovely. So I'm taking as my thread today part of the title of a wonderful exhibition, Refuge, the Art of Belonging, that was held last year in Abbot Hall in Kendal, as part of Monica's Insiders Outsiders Festival. And we were lucky enough to have quite a few blocks in that exhibition, and some of you may have been there and seen that show. So I'm very grateful to Monica for both inviting me to talk today and obviously for opening the doors for so many of us to talk about and think about our refugee parents and grandparents. And of course, I'm grateful to David for introducing me. So I'm here to think about belonging in relation to the art of my grandfather, the painter Martin Bloch. And I'm going to disappear and you will then see my screen. So here he is. This is a self-portrait from 1926. And I'm going to say a little bit about what belonging might have meant to my mother as well, who came to Britain with her parents, Martin and Lotta, when she was 12 in 1934. And I might even get around to thinking a little bit about what it might mean to be the daughter of, and granddaughter of refugees. So to start with me, very, very briefly, I'm really aware that compared to those two previous generations, my life, like many of my contemporaries in the UK, has been fortunately and remarkably stable. I've only really ever moved from North to South London, quite a move, but still via Cambridge, where, as David said, I studied and then taught for many years. Whereas my parents moved to London from Scotland and Yorkshire, my dad, and from Berlin via Denmark, my mother. So the question of belonging is a strange one. I've been circling around writing about my family, my extended family and my grandfather in particular for many years. As David has said, I'm an academic and much of my teaching is in 18th century English literature and visual culture. But at the moment I'm co-editing, I think I can see my co-editor Alistair Robinson is with us. I'm co-editing a book for Bloomsbury called Cultures of London, Legacies of Migration, which has grown out of a course that I set up at New College of the Humanities, looking at London specifically as a place of migration and immigration, focusing on the responses to London and the contributions of writers and artists from many migrant communities who've made London their home from the early modern period till now. It's quite an eclectic mix of people, and I can see a couple of contributors also have joined today, which is great. So I am currently trying to think about questions of belonging and hopefully skirting back to writing about my family. As David said in his introduction, Bloch, is one of the big painters of this period. He painted mostly landscapes and still lives. I've got a still life behind me from 1927, but I'm talking mostly about the landscapes today, and there are occasional portraits. As you can see, we have a self-portrait in front of us. His landscapes above all are characterized by a profound engagement with place, and that was manifested in his practice. He produced many drawings. We've got boxes and boxes of sketchbooks, and I'm going to show a few drawings today. And he produced drawings in situ until he found what he called his motif. According to my mother, he talked about stalking his motif. And the motif didn't just mean a particular view, it meant that view in a particular moment and responding to a particular light, usually. So he didn't actually paint outdoors, he painted in the studio extremely slowly, distilling something about that specific place, those specific light conditions and those colors. So the painting that I'm really starting with is, whoops, I did this before, here we go, is called Hope Leaving Schloss Schonhagen. It's one of the very last paintings that Martin worked on before leaving Germany in 1934. It shows a cherub-like figure flying, though his wings are rather indistinct. They're kind of like these little sort of fiery wings here, I think. It almost looks as though he's skydiving, perhaps kind of free falling away from a balcony on this side with a prominent column and flying out and over towards a formal garden. It suggests two important things about Bloch's view of the world. There's a coming together here of a brilliant, almost fauve use of colour and a very strong expressionist point of view. And I think it's that kind of fusion of the fauve and the expressionist that really characterises Martin's vision. In this painting, it's perhaps exaggerated as you've got very heavy lines that work against as well as with the colour. And unusually, there's a sense of it being a bit like a print where the register is slightly off. As in, for example, this tree here, where the kind of outline isn't really filled in with the dark green and that kind of bush. It creates a very strong, I think, theatrical dynamic with this orange of the parterre here and the yellow of the tree just above the Cupid figure standing out and complementing those colours very strongly, the kind of yellow and blue bouncing off each other. Whilst the architectural form contrasts with the fleeing, flying body and the heavily stylized landscape garden. The painting then, I think, suggests a series of dislocations in its techniques as well as its themes. It's called Hope Leaving Schloss Schonhagen, or Cupid Fleeing. Many of the titles of Bloch's works were in fact my grandmother's and sometimes reflect her language. She was a journalist and a writer. But on this occasion, I think it's pretty obvious what's happening here. The house was built by one of Martin's uncles, the publishing giant Rudolf Mosse, who, amongst other things, had founded one of Berlin's main newspapers, the Berliner Tageblatt, in 1872. Rudolf Mosse had bought the Schonhagen and Stannenhagen estate for around 1 million marks and built this, the main house, in the early 1900s. So I think the painting is just kind of off this bit of balcony here. The Cupid is fleeing from there. Incidentally, it's about 45 kilometers southwest of Berlin, and now somewhat ironically next to Schonhagen Airport. When my grandparents would visit in the 1920s and early 30s, they would have been visiting Martin's cousin, Rudolf's heir, Hans Lachmann Mosse, who married Rudolf's daughter Felicity, adopted the family name, and inherited the house along with the newspaper empire. Incidentally, Hans and Felicity were the parents of the very, very well-known American historian, George Mosse. So in 1933, the year before my grandparents and mother left Germany, the 500-hectare estate was expropriated by the Nazis, and the family business was Aryanized, and the family left for America. This photograph shows the house in 2019, having been repatriated to the Mosse family before being sold on in 2020. In fact, I think this is from the estate agent's spec. Martin's mother, Margarete Mosse, my great-grandmother, was one of Rudolf Mosse's youngest sisters. So here she is to the left in this photograph of the 6 Mosse daughters, the 6 Mosse girls. They're all Rudolf's sisters. He also had 6 brothers. And here she is again in a much more relaxed family photograph, seated here in the middle next to her husband. And that's my mother, Barbara, here in the arms, as a very young girl, in the arms of my grandmother, Lotte. And here's Martin, the painter. This is his older brother, Max, with his, Fritz with his wife here, and their 3 children. The one that my mother was closest to was this cousin Conrad, who went off to America and was given the Nobel Prize for his work on discovering cholesterol and looking at his father, grandfather. Yeah. Okay, so there's another photograph slightly later. Barbara's a little bit older in this one. Again, Margarete, Martin's mother, there in the middle. There's a lovely, sketchy early portrait of my grandmother Lotte, whom I'm named after. She was Charlotte, but always called Lotte, from 1920, painted in the greenhouse on the Schonhagen estate. Her striking red hair and blue eyes with a slightly unfocused gaze kind of blend in with this very wonderful vegetation behind her. When Martin and Lotte visited from Berlin, it must have been quite a contrast to their dynamic, artistic urban life in Weimar, Berlin. Martin shared a studio first with Anton Kerschbaumer, and then when he died with Carl Schmidt-Rottluff. And Martin and Lotte wrote either fiction published in the Berlin newspapers or theatre reviews. My mother, Barbara, who was born in 1922, told me that she'd often accompany her mother when she went to the theatre if the plays were written for children, as they sometimes were. Martin and Lotte had met through one of Lotte's twin brothers, Helmut Rohrmann, who later became a chief picture restorer at the National Gallery in London, and also makes it having his own chapter in Monica's book. Martin and Helmut were friends and had ended up living and working together, traveling through Spain, probably rather conveniently stuck there for the duration of the First World War. This painting from 1916, one of the earliest that we still have in the family, shows a family on the patio in Malaga. It's a small painting, predominantly green and pink. The blocky buildings in the background, I think, suggest something of Cézanne's approach to form. Unsurprisingly, perhaps, as Bloch had traveled in early 1914 to the south of France, following in the footsteps of Cézanne, before moving on to Spain. According to my brother, he'd been Peter, who's not here, but I see my other brother Adrian is here, so shout out to the family. Peter, I should say, has done a lot of work on Bloch and produced the very wonderful catalogue for the big exhibition we had at the Sainsbury Centre a few years ago. So according to Peter, he'd been encouraged to go to the south of France by his friend, the Bulgarian Jewish artist Jules Pasquin, known sometimes as the Prince of Montparnasse. Bloch had been in Paris in 1912 and maybe found some kind of context for his art in the circle of artists around Jules Pasquin. Incidentally, Bonhams have just had a really big sale focused on the so-called Jewish artists of the École de Paris. Pasquin was himself, as were so many others, a displaced figure. He was born in Hungary to Italian-Serbian parents, Italian-Serbian on one side and Spanish-Jewish parents on the other side. He settled in France and then in America. Other friends of Martin's in those early years in Spain included Sonia and Robert Delaney and Marie Laurencin, here seen in another Spanish era painting, this one of a garden in Malaga. This is a close-up, sorry, these are not great images, these ones. Here Laurencin's just about visible. She's kind of become one of the plants really in the full painting. Bloch showed these and other Spanish paintings in Paul Caceres' gallery after his return to Berlin in a very successful one-man show in 1919. He'd already been included in a group show in Paul Caceres. By 1920, he and Lotte had married, moving into Lotte's Kalmerstrasse flat, the flat she had in her previous existence as a rather glamorous widow of a Czechoslovakian theatre director. Bloch was in fact her third husband. And in 1926, Bloch opened his own school of painting with Anton Kirschbaumer. And then when Kirschbaumer died, Carl Schmidt-Rottloff took over as his partner. So the flyer for the school that you can see there has Schmidt-Rottloff's name on it on the left, but it still is called the Bloch, it's still called the Bloch Kirschbaumer School. Barbara, my mother, by the way, kind of said that it was really very convenient by the time that Schmidt-Rottloff took over in 1931. It was very convenient that he was not Jewish. In the 20s, Martin's early paintings of Berlin suggest a very sort of glamorous, I think, vision. This is Berlin drawing room of 1920. There's a lovely outdoor scene. This is the bridge in Tiergarten, 1920, the same year. Very elegant, very obviously 1920s. This painting is in Bristol City Art Gallery. Later, his paintings of Berlin become rather more ominous and more focused on architectural forms. He celebrated the city, both its older and its more new architecture. This one is Caryatids, Friedrichstrasse, 1931. Quite often in Bloch's paintings, you have a sense that the inanimate objects are sometimes at least as alive or kind of sentient as the animate. So here we got some people here who are very, very in the sketch on the right, very briefly sketched in people with no faces, whereas the carved caryatids look very much more sort of alive, really, which is kind of amusing. Other paintings celebrate the modernism of the new architecture of Berlin. Here's a drawing of Ulandstrasse on the left, near where the Blochs lived. And in 1922, Bloch's cousin, Hans Lachmann Mosse, had commissioned Erich Mendelssohn to rebuild the Mosse House on Jerusalemstrasse. And that's what we're looking at on the right. That's the Mosse House, and actually has Rudolf Mosse's name on the bottom there. So I think Martin was very aware of contemporary architecture. The most dramatic of this period is, here's the Kurfürstendamm relating to that drawing we just looked at. And the most dramatic painting of this period is Fehrbelliner Platz of 1933. This is in the Expressionist art collection in Leicester, and they've got the drawing to go with the painting. And you can see here that the drawing on the right is squared up for being transferred onto the canvas. So that's kind of how he worked from drawings to canvas. And Peter's written a lot about this drawing and its kind of ominous sense of impending disquiet. Bloch clearly had an interest in contemporary architecture. He had originally left home with the expressed intention of studying architecture in Berlin in 1902. But by 1905, he was studying aesthetics in Munich with the Swiss art historian Heinrich Wörflin. And by 1907, he was taking drawing lessons with Lovis Corinth in Berlin. And that's probably how he met Kirschbaumer, who was also a pupil of Corinth's. And Corinth had painted many wealthy Berlin families, including another one of Bloch's Mosse cousins, Bianca and Richard Israel, in 1899. being a painter was not at all what Martin's parents had intended for him. As David has said, born in 1883, he was born in Silesia, in Nysa, which is now confusingly in Poland, and is now called Nysa. The family were Jewish, but Martin and his brother were sent to a Catholic gymnasium, and it was a town with a huge number of Catholic churches, a very strong Catholic presence. I think Martin was actually taught by Jesuits. And it's likely that he was named Martin. His birthday was November the 16th. The closest Saint's Day was St. Martin on November the 11th. And there are paintings that I haven't got included here, but he actually painted himself as St. Martin in his early work. His brother was called Fritz. Martin was meant to enter the family lace business. Art was not part of the parents' lives. And when he refused, his brother gave up a very successful legal career to step in and run the business instead. My mother recalled Martin giving his parents a painting for their golden wedding anniversary. Here they are again, the parents with the grandchildren. And the wedding anniversary was in 1927, golden wedding anniversary. So Peter speculates this may have been the painting that they gave. That Martin gave his parents, which is a portrait of Barbara from 1928, looking pretty similar in age to how she is in that painting, in the photograph. But apparently the parents looked at this painting, but then never hung it. They kept it rolled up, much to Martin's disappointment. So his kind of artistic bent was not really from his family in the slightest. Alongside his Berlin paintings of the 1920s are other landscape paintings. Several are of Bavaria. Here, fields in the Bavarian hills from 1922. Looking very Mediterranean, I have to say, for Bavaria. And many of the paintings in this era are of the North Italian landscape in Lago di Garda, the wonderful North Italian lake that the family went to pretty much annually for 6 years between 1924 and 1930. They would spend 4 or 5 months of each long summer on the shores of Lake Garda. As a child, Barbara was pretty much bilingual. And when I went with her to Berlin in the early 1990s on a kind of government-sponsored, sorry, we murdered your grandmother, but have a 10 days holiday on us trip, a reparation trip. The one restaurant that we kept returning to, the one place, in fact, where Barbara felt remotely comfortable, I think, was an Italian restaurant on the Fuggerstrasse. Barbara described the annual pilgrimage traveling by train from Berlin with numerous large trunks, which had to be counted each time they went off the train and every time they changed trains, with different border guards in different uniforms as they went from Germany to Austria to Italy. This is Torbeli Harbour on the right. The students came too, traveling separately. They stayed in different villas by the lake, where they drew and painted and swam. So here are some of the houses by the lake that they would have stayed in. This one's called the Terraces. It's a very large and very tall painting. Barbara watched the ferries. She talked a lot about the weather, the extraordinary weather in Lake Garda, kind of changing in the morning, in the afternoon, and the ferries going up and down being her kind of version of train spotting. She played with local Italian children, loved the fresh made pasta from the locals who worked for them, and persuaded the students to let her wash their hair in the lake with cakes of olive oil soap. I remember her telling me this and me being quite confused as to why this was such an exciting thing to do. But this very wonderful existence, I think, came to an end with the rise of fascism. There's an extraordinary painting from 1930, from the end of this period, that depicts an Italian butcher's shop. Up here on the left is a mask of Mussolini. Every shop had to display Mussolini's face by 1930. And there's this kind of extraordinary, I think, dialogue between the face here, the dead meat, the peasant / butchers who are kind of dead meat, as it were, and this piece, this sort of animal's head, who's clearly a dead animal and who is looking at least as alive as this person here. And there's a kind of fish falling out of a basket. It's a very strongly allegorical painting. I've been asked when I've given talks before about how they knew that they should be leaving Germany as early as they did. They left, as David has already told us, they left in 1934. Several things. They had to move from the Kammerstrasse flat to another rather less desirable flat. And Barbara, when we went back to Berlin to look, she talked about her bedroom looking out onto the schoolyard where she watched the Hitler Youth marching and listened to their songs about wanting Jewish blood to flow. A Mosse cousin was taken into custody. Later, his body was thrown from a moving car in Potsdamer Platz. Lotte wasn't allowed to publish. Martin, as secretary of the Artists' Union in Berlin, was responsible for hanging their annual exhibition in 1933, and the SA, led by Prince August Wilhelm, broke in and removed some of the paintings. So there were quite a lot of signs that that being Jewish in Berlin, however assimilated the family were, which they were heavily assimilated, was increasingly unsafe. It's pretty obvious that my grandmother, Lotte, was instrumental in finding the means for the family to leave Germany. The story I was consistently told was that she'd been at an event organized by Penn International in 1933. The Danish writer Karen Michaelis came to speak. And at the end of her talk, she announced, "For you, my friends, who will not be able to live in your own country much longer, I'm building huts on my island." My mother, or grandmother, whose story this was, would pause dramatically and then say that no one really knew what she was talking about. This was 1933. Nevertheless, in the summer of 33, they went to stay on holiday in Denmark with Karen Michaelis. And then in the summer of 34, they went again, but without intending to go back. They stayed on Thun and her island, and my mother, aged 12, was given the choice of remaining there with her father or returning with my grandmother to Berlin when she went back to organize getting out what possessions she could, mostly the contents of Martin's studio, the furniture of one room, and some of her jewelry. I'm wearing a ring that came out of Germany with my grandmother today for good luck. Barbara, quite understandably, I think, chose to stay with her father, and she spent the summer with other families in transit, playing with Lutti Wedekind, cooking scrambled eggs for Bertolt Brecht and Walter Benjamin, whilst, according to her, they played Monopoly. Martin painted, and the Danish paintings suggest a period of transition, of waiting. This painting of Svenborg Harbour is in the Ben Uri collection, and it's very typical. Bloch exploring the geometry of boats and their cargo, chaotic. The outlines here in purple suggesting in purple set against a rather acid green warehouse in the background and a swirling pinky grey sky. Actually, through the sky, you can see this is another painting where you can just about, in the areas of thinner paint, you can just about see the lines behind. The Ben Uri catalogue suggests this claustrophobic depiction of boats in a crowded harbour is a classic symbol of exile. You can see at the bottom right-hand corner, there's one figure here just about visible in one of the boats. Very often you have these sort of very marginally visible figures. Another very square painting shows a postman against the steep roofs of half-timbered houses against a cloudless dark blue sky, and obviously waiting for the post with people coming and going, and Lotte in Berlin would have been a very important thing. When they came to London, they lived at 130 Ebury Street, according to my mother, in a flat above a brothel. Martin gave this address on his application for naturalisation, dating his stay there from the 12th of September 1934 until November the 5th, 1936, which would have been my grandmother's 50th birthday. It was at this address that Martin set up a school of contemporary painting and drawing with the Australian artist Roy de Maistre, which opened in October 1934. In this flyer for that, this kind of complement to the flyer for the German art school, you can see that Mark Bloch's name is here, but he's actually stuck, there's an actually kind of label stuck on it saying, "Now at larger premises, Studio 3, Edward Square." They moved from Ebury Street to Edward Square. So I think, and the label probably covers up Roy de Maistre's name, and Roy never, he didn't really do very much in the art school. I think he was just a sort of, it was one of the things that helped get them into London, was the fact that he was one of the people who vouched for them. Though the drawing on the left shows the view down from the Ebury Street flat, looking down, I think this is one that my brother Peter dug out recently, and has this rather, it's an ironmonger's, and there's a painting of this view, and I think this line, "We can repair it," is rather wonderful outside the ironmonger's. There are, I think, 37 paintings depicting London's subjects, 13 of which are produced before the war. One of the earliest dates from 1935, when Martin painted the busy Victoria Station just up the road from Ebury Street. He clearly enjoyed the colours of London street furniture, the blue box here, the red and gold buses, the cabs and the commuters. And here, this brilliant glowing orange Militia Beacon with its zebra-striped post, actually a novelty. The first Militia Beacons only came out in 1934. And I was amused to find, when I was researching this, I was amused to find that the Leslie Hall Militia, who invented the Militia Beacon and was responsible for the first Road Traffic Act of 1934, who was the Minister of Transport, was himself also Jewish and from Hampstead. Other London paintings from this period include the wonderful All Souls and the BBC. Again, an appreciation of an international modern style painting here, architect building here, the BBC building here, dating from 1932, set against the dramatic spire of All Souls. This is a really key painting, kind of combining church here with sort of state sponsored news of the kind that was reliable, as opposed to the kind that he'd left in Germany. These paintings suggest a kind of belonging in London. Peter told me recently that Lotte had told him that Martin loved seeing the Metropolitan Water Board metal plates in the streets. I'm showing you one from Regent Street, saying he was delighted to see that his initials were engraved on the streets of London. I don't know if he did have a W middle name. I haven't found that out yet. When they came to London in 1934, Martin was 50. He turned 51 in London in November that year, and Lotte was 48. Barbara, age 12, this is her a bit later, this is her age 15, was sent to an English boarding school. She went to Edgbaston Church of England School in Birmingham as a charity pupil. I think, like Eva Tucker last week, incidentally, a good friend of hers in later days, it was a Quaker teacher in the school who was instrumental in organising this. In Barbara's case, the wonderful Francesca Wilson, who had dedicated her life to teaching and to helping refugees in many different eras. Barbara spent a few months living with a family in Birmingham to learn English before boarding. So this painting is painted 3 years later, suggesting her kind of having grown up. She's at age 15, she's poised on the verge of adulthood. She's wearing a very grown-up suit. Absolutely the English schoolgirl, her direct gaze, somewhat inscrutable, suggests perhaps that she's not only growing up, but also in some ways perhaps growing away from her parents. I'd always thought her outfit quite strange. I knew that the school was evacuated during the war to Attingham Park in Shropshire. And here's a photograph of the girls, bottom left, arriving at Attingham. Looking at that photograph, I can see that she might well have fitted in. This is Attingham Park today on the right. So they were evacuated there. Actually, I've got, and then Peter, my brother, turned up with this wonderful photograph of Barbara actually in school uniform, looking just like those girls. So here she is in her suit on the left and in school uniform on the right, probably in Edward Square. She stayed on after she'd finished her schooling to help look after the younger children. And she remembered in vivid detail the beautiful country house with its Angelica Kaufmann paintings. Her other school memories included having to walk to church on a Sunday in a crocodile of girls, all wearing gloves, knitting blankets for communist fighters in the Spanish Civil War, implausibly, but thanks again to Francesca Wilson, and also implausibly being invited to smoke Sobrani cocktail cigarettes by Matron when she was in the sixth form. Francesca Wilson also introduced Barbara to Nicholas Pevsner, who, I think, missing his own family, continued to visit her when she later went to Durham University, where she studied French and German, and Pevsner took her to see churches. She talked about how different her school and home experiences were, switching from being an English schoolgirl during term time to coming home and sleeping on the studio couch during the holidays, watching French films, meeting other refugees. Despite Martin's students, they were short of money. A highlight was a trip to Lyons Corner House. In 1936, Martin and Lotte had moved to Edward Square, and there are beautiful lyrical paintings of the square. this is summer 1937, but I especially like this one from spring 1937, with this extraordinary burst of kind of ice blue blossom here against the kind of pre-storm light that London does so well and Bloch painted so often. There was actually, it looked a bit like this in the sky around me in South London this afternoon. Their friends included emigre artists, later Jankel Adler, who moved to London in 1943, and that's probably whom they met Josef Herman through, and Joseph and Martin became very firm friends. Artistically, during this time, Bloch was doing well. There were exhibitions, including a major one at Lefebvre Gallery in 1939, but things got more precarious with the event of war in September 39. In June 1940, Martin, like so many other German nationals, he was still German, despite having lodged his naturalization papers pretty much 5 years earlier. I think they were 2 weeks too short. Was interned, sent to Huyton and then Sefton in Douglas on the Isle of Man. Here, apparently the camp commander, realizing Bloch was a distinguished artist, gave him access to art materials, and he was marched out of the camp under guard to draw in the commandant's house. Back in London, Lotte wrote endless letters, and in 1941 succeeded in getting him released under the category 18B, referring to people distinguished in the arts and sciences. This drawing, sometimes referred to as Through the Wire, I think is one of the most striking of that era. These drawings have had a lot of attention. They've been exhibited in a lot of the exhibitions around internment. This painting, Miracle in the Internment Camp, which also was seen in lots of exhibitions last year during Monica's festival, is the strongest record of his experience. It shows a group of refugees in a kind of Last Supper-like motif here, with one of Bloch's friends, Walter Nessler, top center, breaking bread, watched by Kaufmann here, Martin himself with his recognizable beret, and Fred Cormis in the bottom left-hand corner. Here's someone who doesn't see what's going on. And what's going on is the food that they were given every day, which were herrings and boiled potatoes, turning into mermaids. My grandmother always talked about them missing their wives. I think it's a very kind of ambiguous kind of sexual image. Mermaids, obviously you can't have sex with a mermaid, but here are men stuck in internment camp. Barbara told a friend, Anne, in fact, who's here today, in 2001, that Martin had come out a broken and uncentered man, and that internment had shaken his faith in the UK. She said he felt crushed, betrayed, and misunderstood. And there's certainly some disturbing other disturbing paintings from this era. This one, The Dream of the Dragon from 1941. For some reason, I used to hang in my rooms when I taught at Jesus College, Cambridge, to disconcert the students. Next to this one, which is Cherub's Head, I think from bombed out London. Ironically, when Bloch was released, he was given a permit from the Ministry of Defence, which allowed him to record the bomb damage in the City of London. He drew and painted bombed out city churches. I'm showing you Kensington rooftops after the fire raid in 1944. And on the right, there's a painting Dusk in Wartime London, which shows some fire watchers. Bloch actually worked as a fire watcher. Martin's mother, Margareta, had died in January 1943. She'd been transported to Theresienstadt. Her death recorded by yet another Mosse relation, Eva Noack Mosse, who was forced to work in the Central Evidence Office of Theresienstadt in 1945, making lists for the Nazis. She actually recorded the exact date of Margareta's death, her great aunt, on January the 31st, 1943. I don't yet know how soon after Martin found out. There are a couple of extraordinarily strong wartime paintings. Survival on the left, Scorched Trees, City of London, 1943 on the right. And I've included a little drawing in this one because I think these figures here in this drawing, and that suggests something of the kind of texture of his drawing. I think these are the same little group here, because this building here is clearly that building there, kind of feeding into that painting. The Blochs moved around a lot during the war in London, looking after houses whose owners had evacuated to the countryside. At one point, Lotte became a housekeeper for a house vacated by the Whaley Cohens in Kensington, and she took in lodgers. I remember her talking about this. She'd grown up in a very privileged family. She didn't even know how to boil an egg when she got married. And here she was cooking for lodgers, carrying their coal up to their rooms. They were bombed out of at least one of these houses. Barbara described using climbing ropes to climb through the rubble of a house in Camden Hill Road, I think this one, in order to rescue paintings from the wreck. This back view of the back gardens dates from 1944, and you have this barrage balloon up in the sky here. Again, it's that very kind of steely storm light, and in the foreground, this kind of very strong vegetation sort of taking over. Lots of writers of this period talk about the Rose Bay willow herb growing in the bombed out buildings. Another view of a back garden is in Hampstead Hill Gardens. This one's in Monica's book. Two versions of this. This is the version in the, I think in the British Embassy in Madrid at the moment. Ironically, we moved into a flat in Hampstead Hill Gardens in 1980, and my mother lived there until she died in 2011. So this one has particular resonance. And there's another painting, also back gardens. I'd always thought this was outside London, but according to the letter very nicely included in the Leicester City Museum's website, this painting apparently was from Camden Hill Road, and this was kind of a garden that they found access to. It's very kind of tells you something about how the narratives gets passed down. Here's a letter from my grandmother talking about how this painting came about. It feels as though Bloch is singling out London's gardens in this era, finding sustenance in what nature there is in the city during wartime, which is a pretty familiar experience to those of us who've lived in London in the last year, I think, more familiar than it would have been. Another way Lotte kept him going during the duration of the war, after he'd returned from internment, was to bring home flowers. And there are a wonderful series of flower by night drawings, some of them made during the blackout. And then there is this great painting, Iris and Tulips from 1941, which I've always loved. They had made at least one trip out of London. There's a Dorset painting from 1944. And then in 45, post-war, Bloch painted a wonderful series of landscapes around Shaftesbury, especially Blackmore Vale, seen here, part of the Stour Valley. He also painted cress beds, the solitary figure in this one, suggestive of the figures in the Bavarian fields of the 1920s. These paintings, I think, suggest a kind of resolution after the trauma of internment and surviving the Blitz in London. They also found a more permanent London home, thanks to Josef Herman. Alma's Studios here on the left was Joseph's studio till he left for Wales in 1946, when he passed it on to Martin. This was their most secure London flat, with Lotte staying on in Alma's Studios until after Martin's death in 1954, when she moved in with my parents to their tall, thin house in Well Walk. My brother Peter remembers staying frequently with his grandparents at Alma Studios. He recalls a very European building, visitors speaking German, and a Spanish dance teacher on the floor below who produced interesting noises and smells of Spanish cooking. He remembers in the bathroom there was a huge metal bath, an enormous gas geyser, and a great stack of travelling trunks covered in labels, presumably the trunks that carried the studio equipment from Germany to Italy every summer. Coming later, neither I nor my brother Adrian knew Martin, but remember Lotte as a very strong presence in our childhoods. I grew up in the Well Walk house I grew up in. Lotte would entertain her friends, like many of them, like her German-speaking ladies, in her room with its rescued Biedermeier furniture, her desk, a pedimented cupboard. I remember Dora Mosse, a cousin, and Lube Blumenthal. They drank tea without milk or coffee, and they ate slices of pumpernickel topped with cream cheese, circles of cucumber, and a sprinkle of paprika, and that was my job to sprinkle the paprika. Bloch found another form of security too. In 1948, Leonard Daniels, the principal of Camberwell School of Arts and Crafts, invited him to come and teach, which he did until his death in 1954. According to Michael Podrow, Bloch was brought in to counteract what Daniels saw as a narrow provincialism. The school was still following a very much an orthodoxy developed from the Euston Road School and William Coldstream. This painting on the right by one of the pupils there, I think is really amusing, which is a kind of Bloch in full colour against all these men in grey suits. In this, the somewhat truncated last period of his life, he died in age 71, his paintings are again lyrical and somewhat freer, whether responding to the huge scale of America. This is the dramatic Mississippi at Minneapolis. He went to visit his stepdaughter, my aunt, the architect Hilda Reiss, who was living in Minneapolis at the Walker Arts Center. This is in the tapes, but it's not on display very often. And there's a wonderful two versions of this painting, which is a condensation of a train journey from Colorado to New Mexico. Another version of this one is in the National Gallery in Ottawa in Canada. So I'd like to finish with another group of works intimately related to Herman. Bloch visited Joseph and his family and painted extensively in Wales from 1947 onwards. He had another friend, he'd visited Bangor slightly earlier. Here's a portrait of a Welsh miner from 1945 and a Welsh village from 1953. The culmination of these Welsh paintings is probably this painting, Down from the Bethesda Quarry of 1950 to 51, where Herman painted miners, Bloch also painted quarrymen. And this was one of the paintings commissioned for the 60 for 51 show, part of the Festival of Britain, that Herman also painted miners for. Very, very large canvases were given to artists, and the paintings were sort of, I think, was seen as going to be going on the walls of the new buildings of the welfare state, kind of post-war revival. Huge canvases, when canvases were very expensive in the immediate post-war period. This was the most forward-looking exhibition of the festival, including work by Bomberg, Lucien Freud, Herman and Bloch, and suggests that this, his very European vision, was, at least at that point, recognized as one important strand of post-war British art. I'm going to leave you with two of the last paintings he finished, which are both Welsh landscapes. Another work with a really suggestive title, The Womb of the Land. I'm not sure again whether that's Martin or Lotta's title, is a Welsh scene, and on the right, the estuary of the River Dee, up towards the boundary between Wales and Liverpool. It's not entirely clear to me where Bloch felt he belonged. He clearly wasn't very German. He's very much a European. I, of course, never got the chance to meet him. I just grew up with the paintings on every wall of our house. But I think in his cityscapes of Berlin and then London, and in his landscapes, which trace the interconnectedness of land, trees, and sky, there's something very grounded about his paintings. And despite their sometimes challenging viewpoints and uncompromising use of colour, I think they still speak to us, or perhaps because of that, I think they still speak to us very strongly of a sense of belonging and a sense of the importance of nature. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Charlotte. That was absolutely fascinating. Let me just ask you, if I may, a few questions just before throwing things open to everybody else. What sort of struck me towards the end in particular of some of those images was what a kind of European outsider he was, like Adler, like Meidner. Do you think he felt that, or do you think the job at Camberwell, the Festival of Britain, began to make him feel more assimilated here?
I'm not sure I can answer that. I think, yeah, I mean, after he died, there was a big Arts Council retrospective. You know, he had a measure of recognition in the 50s. He certainly was very, I mean, there are lots of notes from students from Camberwell who talk about how important he was to their sense of colour. Gillian Ayres, other people, Barry Hurst, lots of students in the Tate archive. How he felt about where he lived, I've got no way of knowing, but it's a good question.
And he came, as you said, he came in at the age of 50.
Yeah.
And later that year turned 51. Do you think there's a sense that that was quite late for rebuilding his career?
Absolutely, yes. And there's a wonderful painting, which I concentrated on landscape. There's a wonderful still life of all the objects that Barbara made him for his birthday. It's called The Calendars. And it kind of has a kind of 50, she'd drawn a 50 on his card that year. I think he was very aware of his age. Yes, absolutely. It's a late time. It's a late time to move. I mean, there are exhibitions. There's one exhibition which is him, Lowry and Moore, I think. You know, he was clocked, and there are some quite interesting reviews of exhibitions. There's another one with him, Lowry, and someone else I've forgotten, and it kind of talks about the differences between kind of Lowry and Bloch as though they're sort of on a par, which now makes kind of, you know, and Moore, I mean, it makes very funny reading, really. But yeah, I think at that point he was noticed, definitely, and therefore presumably he felt that he belonged more.
Because luck is so important in these lives, isn't it? And the sense of whether you come as a writer early enough to learn proper English, or whether you come as an artist early enough to find a new voice or a new palette or something that fits into the British expectations of artists. And it's something that I've been very struck by thinking about refugee writers and artists over the last few years.
I mean, Barbara certainly said that he was lucky that he was an artist and not a writer. I mean, we heard last week about Eva Tucker, you know, and her writing in English, but she was a child. I mean, she was like my mum. She was younger than my mother. So I think, yes, that sort of visual language. I don't know. I mean, when I went to study art history, I was intending to write the book on Martin that no one else in the family got around to writing. And so I went off to the Courtauld. I didn't get onto the right course. And when I went to look at photographs of his work, his folder had been in the Whit Library, had been moved forward and back between Germany and England, literally moved. It kind of could see people of different curators, that kind of, which was, you know, he doesn't really fit. I mean, he's got this kind of expressionist feeling, but it's not, his work doesn't look like lots of other German artists, and it certainly doesn't look like lots of British artists of the 50s. So anyway, I've had a question about the painting behind me. Yeah, I stuck a still life in because there are these wonderful still lifes. It's from 1927 and it's still life against a green ground, green bottles. But it kind of suggests he quite often did this thing, and this is something Michael Podro wrote about. He did this thing of choosing a particular color to dominate a painting. And clearly this one is a kind of study in this kind of turquoisey green with this very bright orange and the flowers. If I move this way, you can see the flowers.
And you mentioned about that wonderful painting from the Benuri collection of the boats in the harbour as a sort of image of exile. And I wonder if there are other aspects of his work or other images in his paintings which also seem to you to speak of exile.
Yes, I mean, certainly, obviously, the painting that I started off with, that's why I kind of pinned it on that painting. Interestingly, there's an account online of someone who saw that painting in the big show at the Sainsbury Centre, who knew nothing about Bloch, and said something about, oh, I think it's a painting for someone who wants to leave the Schloss, and it's about feeling happy about it. And it was this kind of sense of hope and looking forward that they picked up on. Really interestingly, Barbara was very resistant to, and Adrian, who's here, will know this, but Barbara was very resistant to kind of allegorical interpretations of the paintings. Despite being herself working in the field of psychoanalysis, she didn't really kind of promote those interpretations. I mean, there's a still life of draperies where some of the fabrics have got what looks a little bit like a swastika on them, and a sort of little bit like a sort of German kind of wings. And you know, it was this kind of tension between, are they just what they are, or are they not quite what they are? I mean, there are others where it's pretty obvious that they have symbolic meaning.
And finally, which strikes you more, the discontinuity between his work in Germany and afterwards, or the continuity? I'm just struck by that sort of very German yellow that features in his work earlier in Germany and in Denmark, and then later also, as a kind of continuity. But I wonder if you're more struck by the discontinuities in his work.
Maybe other people can tell me from what they've seen. I've just had a note from my brother saying, you haven't mentioned anything about Normandy. It was quite a trial. I'm on David with this. Adrian is messaging me. Yeah, they went to Normandy both before and after the war. I'm not sure what to say about the yellow. I don't know if it's the same. There's a wonderful yellow still life on a yellow ground in the 1920s. There's a lot written about his theories of colour and how he taught, and the idea of there being a warm palette and a cool palette. There are wonderful pictures of him in front of his students with kind of going through these different kind of colour cycles. And you might have noticed I showed a couple of paint versions where there were two different versions, and the same motif has got a very sort of different colour sense to it.
Well, I wonder if I should then sort of pass over to Monica with questions from the audience. If there aren't any, I've got loads more, so just come straight back to me.
Coming in gradually. I've been exhorting people to start asking. I wonder if I can come in just on the back of what David's been commenting on. It does strike me also, I was particularly struck by your bringing together of the sort of idea of Fauvism and Expressionism. Of course, for those art historians among us will know that Fauvism is associated essentially with the French, more classicizing Mediterranean way of looking at the world with a greater sort of more life-affirming, less angst-ridden quality. And Expressionism, of course, is very much all about angst and, you know, sort of tension and so on and so forth. And it does strike me, compared, well, certainly with Josef Herman and also with Jankel Adler, or also people like Hans Feibusch and many others, that nowhere in his work that I'm aware of anyway, and maybe you can correct me here, but as far as I'm aware, nowhere does he wear his heart on his sleeve, and nowhere is he explicit in exploring that, the trauma of dislocation and loss. And that's of course why it's, I think, very tempting, isn't it, for all of us to read allegorical possibilities into the work, which doesn't necessarily divulge them that easily. I wonder if you could comment on that.
Well, I think the painting I showed, the Miracle in the Internment Camp, is the most obviously allegorical, and that's, you know, that's one of the most easily accessible, and speaks to that particular experience.
But that sense of profound dislocation, and indeed the sort of awareness of the murders, you know, of family, which comes out so strongly, of course, in Josef's and also Jankel Adler's work, perhaps slightly more obliquely, but in Josef's work, I mean, there's no point at which he has to express that, you know, up front, as it were, and loud and clear. I just wonder, I mean, on the, you know, sort of alongside that, I mean, do you know if he talked, did he talk to his family about the losses and the trauma? I mean, he, you know, he escaped early, but you've talked about his profound losses in the family.
Again, I don't have an answer for that now. I mean, I think, you know, I mean, my grandmother very much, you know, was the person who should have written, and she was far too interested in what was going on at the moment to talk about the past. So I don't know whether that you're going to kind of read that as sort of denial, or whether that's looking forward. I don't really have an answer for that. I've got a couple of questions on the chat about yellow being significant for Mark and Kandinsky. Yes, absolutely. An artist that he admired very much, I think. Well, I mentioned Cézanne, but also Matisse. I mean, the people he was with in Paris in around 1912 were certainly the students around Matisse. That, and I think that some of the early paintings are very Matisse influenced. And there's another hand. Someone's got a
questions. Come on, everybody.
There's a hand up. Elizabeth Hager. Lizzie's got a question.
Oh, hi. Oh, that's a fantastic talk, Charlotte. Thank you so much. It was amazing. I just wondered, it seemed to me that it was really dramatic, the contrast between the paintings in Berlin and London, that the Berlin ones, the architecture looked so exciting and dynamic, and it seemed much more an image of fizzing creativity. And then London, he depicts in this very soulful, decaying, ruined city. And I heard Carmen Khalil talk recently about how Australians came to London after the war, and they were so disappointed because it seemed so, everything was so shabby, and it was all really a bomb site practically for a long time. Going up Park Lane, it was all ruined. And I thought he depicted that so beautifully, and it was very sort of, in a way, maybe that was his response more through landscape to, rather than producing a graphic response to loss. He tried to sort of depict London as not just a scene of loss, but a scene where he was experiencing loss of a different kind as well, maybe. Very expressionist, or I don't know, but I just wondered if you thought of it about that, because there's so many exhibitions about Berlin as such an important place for architecture and art in these years, and the fact he had to leave it must have been very painful.
I think that's really helpful. Thank you. Yes. I mean, I think there's a massive irony about, you know, being interned and then being set free, and then, you know, every drawing being stamped by the Ministry of Information, and he's recording the German bomb damage on London. And I think, you know, you don't do that without thinking about what's going on. And also for my mother, at that point, she was a student in Durham, and she certainly talked about the irony of being stuck up one of the turrets of Durham Cathedral, which she loved very much as a building, with a bucket of sand, ready to put out the fires from the Baedeker raids that were kind of aiming for Durham. and discharging over Newcastle. So I think, and at that point they were both enemy aliens. I mean, he didn't get his British nationalisation till after. She couldn't leave Durham for more than a few miles without having police, police permission. So I think it's very, it's very complicated. And I think his sense of embracing England, I mean, those pre-war London paintings are very joyful. And then the ones obviously during the war kind of registering this great destruction wrought on the city, but also I think his destruction of his own sense of security. I think it was somewhere that he'd been there long enough. I mean, nearly 5 years. I think he probably felt pretty secure by that point, and then to be interned, and then obviously the war afterwards. But yeah, I'll think more about those paintings.
Oh, thanks.
Charlotte, if I may, I'm very struck, I mean, in your wonderful account of your grandfather's life, the stellar, the eminent names that crop up, almost casually from, what is it, Schmidt, Rotluff, Pascan, Castira, Mendelssohn, et alia, but also within your own more extended family network. Am I right in remembering, well, I mean, you mentioned Helmut Ruhrmann. His brother was an architect, was he not? The twin brother, Fritz? Yeah. And I wondered if you'd like to say a bit more about that. And also Lucy Ree, am I right in remembering there's a family connection there, or have I got that one wrong?
I knew her, but we weren't related.
No, okay. But nevertheless, and there's tremendous sense, isn't there, of this kind of network, quite intimate network throughout his life of really fascinating individuals.
Yeah, lots of people, lots of names. Yeah, there's a Roman, there's at least one Roman granddaughter here. I can see. Right. Claire Malinsky here is a wonderful artist who's a Roman. Roman granddaughter. Well, they were very, very cultured. They knew lots of people. My grandmother knew huge numbers of people through the theatre world. As I said, Martin was her third husband. And she knew, I mean, I haven't started on her. Her second husband died supposedly in the bed next to Thomas Mann from the Magic Mountain kind of thing. I mean, it's just kind of, you sort of read this stuff and you're just not really sure, but I think it's all true. There's a question on the chat which is important. I think I would want to talk to that before we go. Rachel Kolsky asks, I really enjoyed listening. Just wondered if Judaism ever entered their day-to-day life. I don't recall you mentioning things, and apologize if you did, like festivals, Shabbat and so on. No, basically. I mean, I didn't really understand this till I went to Berlin. I went to the Jewish Museum in Berlin. And someone's tea break. And there's a wonderful display all about the very, very assimilated Jews of Berlin on the second floor of the Jewish Museum. And I kind of didn't understand that my mother used to say to me. She'd say, oh yes, everybody was Jewish, but she kind of, in retrospect, but she didn't know she was Jewish until the Christmas of 1933, where they were told they had to have Hanukkah and not Christmas, and they didn't know what to do. So when I went to Berlin with my mother, we had a guide who was called an Emigrant Referral, as though they were emigres, which kind of annoyed her. And we got shown round, and we went to the Rathaus in East Germany and in East Berlin. And she showed us this kind of directory. She said, oh, this is like the phone directory of the Gemeinde, the Jewish community in Berlin in your parents' period. She said, talking to my mum. And Barbara said, oh, well, we won't be in there because we didn't go to synagogue. And we weren't, we weren't part of the Gemeinde. And they looked, and sure enough, they were in there. So they were racially identified as Jewish, very, very obviously, but they, in this book that still existed when I went there in the early 90s. But no, absolutely, they didn't go to synagogue. I think Martin's father occasionally, and certainly the generation before, were observant, but there was no sense of Jewish religious identity in his life. In fact, I think he was very drawn to Catholicism. As I said, he kind of painted himself as a saint. And then Barbara converted. I mean, not surprisingly, being sent off to a good English boarding school, she became for a while quite a kind of high Anglican. So basically, sorry, no. Which again doesn't make his work popular for people kind of wanting to, wanting identity politics. It's not great.
But again, that's also very common among the kind of creative individuals we're talking about here under the umbrella, insiders, outsiders. And in fact, again, David, turning to you, I mean, Joseph was very much the exception, coming from a Yiddish, quite impoverished Orthodox background, very much the exception that proved the rule in terms of the artist's sort of background and beliefs and so on. Right, we've got lots of nice comments coming in. Somebody asking whether you had any, or whether Martin, sorry, had any relationship with, I assume Bomberg rather than Bromberg, David Bomberg?
I don't think so.
One might suppose there was some connection, but you're not aware of it. No.
No, I don't think the date quite fit. Not aware. No.
Do you want to, we should probably begin to wind up, but I discovered just this evening, as you discovered, that your mother actually worked with Anna Freud, and I wondered whether you'd like to just say a few words about that and about her.
Okay. Well, I guess, I was thinking, I mean, I really strayed, I mean, I didn't really deal with what it means to belong. Sorry, I talked about being in places, I didn't really talk about belonging. I think one place that my mother absolutely did belong was at the Anna Freud Centre, as was the Hampstead Child Therapy Clinic, where I think she got a job when I was about 5. She went in as a psychiatric social worker. Her training was as a social worker. She'd been a teacher. As I said, she read English, she read French and German at university, and then she taught in schools, in girls' schools usually, and then did a mental health training and ended up as a psychiatric social worker. So she then worked at the Freud Centre till she retired, and she retired when she was really old. And yeah, absolutely, she was welcomed into this very European world that she clearly felt pretty comfortable in. A lot of the analysts were actually emigres from South Africa. There are a lot of Jewish South African kind of very left-wing analysts who'd had to leave South Africa for political reasons. It was a very interesting environment. What can I tell you? I mean, they used to have their weekly meetings inside in Freud's rooms with all the artwork on the walls. As we all know, the Freuds brought their housekeeper from Vienna with them. So my dad would sometimes carry her shopping up from John Barnes on the Finchley Road, to carry Paris shopping up the road. I mean, it was a sort of extension probably of a version of life that she was very familiar with, and I think it's no surprise that she ended up, and she taught child development. So one of the things I was trying to do was to kind of start writing, and a few years ago, and a friend who's an academic and a sociologist and literary critic had sat down with my mother to record a lot of her stories, and I thought, great, I don't have to do this because someone who's knows what they're doing, is not a family member, is doing it. And I sat down to listen to them, and we didn't really get much beyond Barbara's nursery school, because it was all about the kind of politics of nursery schools and early childhood education and so on. And that was what she did professionally. She taught the young analysts about early child development.
Fascinating. Had at least two comments which you've probably spotted in the chat saying, come on, write that book. I mean, there's a book begging to be written quite clearly, isn't there? So do remember that. And lots of comments on the beautiful way you delivered, how fluently you spoke, etc., etc. Lovely. So last chance, anybody to ask a question? No. All right, very good. Well, just a few words by way of conclusion, if I may. Hold on, this is really okay. Okay, more compliments coming in. Just to say, for those of you who'd like to listen again, or indeed tell your friends about this very engaging session, it has been recorded and it will be uploaded onto the Insiders Outsiders YouTube channel within a week or so. And if you're not familiar with the YouTube channel, we have recordings there of virtually every online event we've had in this last year or so. So there are plenty of interesting and interconnected topics that are being talked about there. I've mentioned that at 8 o'clock, for those of you who haven't known about it and might still have the energy, another granddaughter talking about a very, very fascinating but much less well-known grandfather figure. It's Gilly Allenby talking about her grandfather, who was called in England John Ivor Allenby, but otherwise known as Johannes Imari Auerbach, which immediately tells a story. So if you're at all intrigued, he was a sculptor primarily with a very colourful and interesting and intriguing life history, which he's in the process of researching. And if I could just end by making again a few connections, so many connections, both to past events, to the whole topic generally, into things being planned for the future. Apropos the Anna Freud connection and your mother, some of you will be interested to know that there are plans afoot for a one-day conference organized between Insiders Outsiders and the Research Centre for German and Austrian Exile Studies at the University of London to explore this rich and I think relatively underexplored topic of the émigrés' contribution to concepts and indeed the experiences of childhood, where psychotherapy, art therapy, particularly in relation to children, will be explored in more depth. Also internment, of course, such a rich and murky subject, and the work that Martin did there is obviously very intriguing, and I think, you know, one can build on that to explore the subject further, and there have been quite a number of talks on various aspects of internment, and particularly the creativity in the internment situation, in a way against all the odds, which again are on the YouTube channel, and more to come, this being the 80th anniversary of that episode, even a trip for those of you who might be interested to the Isle of Man in October, which is going to be advertised shortly. I could go on, but I think that's probably quite enough for one evening. Very, very many thanks, Charlotte. That was absolutely wonderful, as I expected. And to you, David, as ever, many thanks indeed. And thank you for being here, everyone. Perhaps I'll see you later, but if not, on another day, I hope. All the very best, and good night. Good night.
Thank you, Monica, and thank you, everyone.
Bye.